Before we begin, if you value deep, serious history that focuses on survival, logistics, and the overlooked details that actually decide outcomes, subscribe to The Survival Record. This channel exists for viewers who want more than surface narratives. And you know this story is a perfect example of why that matters. One of the quietest failures of the Second World War wasn't on the battlefield. It happened in gardens, allotments, and food policy offices. During the war, several nations depended on vegetables that could survive bombings, rationing, fuel shortages, and labor collapse. Plants that grew back year after year, often reaching the height of small trees. They fed civilians, prisoners, resistance cells, and isolated rural families when supply chains failed completely. And yet, after the war, most of these crops were deliberately abandoned, bred out, or forgotten. Not because they didn't work, but because they worked too well for a world that no longer wanted resilience. Understanding why these vegetables disappeared tells us something uncomfortable about modern food systems, post-war priorities, and what societies choose to remember when crisis fades. What wartime agriculture actually required when industrial food systems broke down. By 1939, most European countries were already dependent on centralized agriculture, imported fertilizers, mechanized farming, and rail transport. War shattered all of that. Fertilizer production was redirected to explosives, fuel shortages grounded tractors. Farm labor vanished into armies or factories. Urban populations were suddenly expected to survive on what could be grown close to home, often in bomb-damaged soil with little planning or expertise. Under these conditions, annual crops were fragile. They required seed stock, timing, soil preparation, and consistent labor. Miss one season, and the system collapsed. Governments and local communities quietly rediscovered something older and far more durable: perennial vegetables. These plants didn't need yearly replanting. Many could be propagated by cuttings. Some tolerated poor soil, cold, drought, or neglect. And crucially, they provided calories and micronutrients over long periods, not just a single harvest window. Perennial vegetables were not exotic wartime inventions. They were remnants of pre-industrial food knowledge pushed aside by modern agriculture. Crops like perennial kale, tree collards, good King Henry, Jerusalem artichokes, sea beet, and perennial leeks had long histories across Europe. During the Second World War, they re-emerged not because they were fashionable, but because they were reliable. In Britain, perennial kales and sea kale were quietly encouraged in rural areas because they survived air raids and neglect. In occupied Europe, especially in parts of France, Poland, and the Balkans, perennial greens became fallback food sources when annual crops were confiscated or destroyed. Jerusalem artichokes in particular became notorious. They were difficult to eradicate, grew aggressively, and produced edible tubers even in compacted or bombed soil. German authorities encouraged them because they fed people without competing directly with grain logistics, though civilians often resented them for digestive reasons rather than nutritional failure. These plants functioned as living food reserves. Once established, they could be harvested repeatedly for years, even decades. Some perennial kales grow into woody, tree-like forms, producing leaves continuously. For households facing ration cuts or unpredictable access to markets, this mattered more than yield per acre. Wartime agricultural policy was honestly brutally pragmatic. Ministries of food cared mainly about calories, resilience, and controllability. Perennial vegetables were useful because they reduced dependence on seed distribution, fuel, and transport. They also allowed households to shoulder part of the survival burden without constant state intervention. However, this same resilience made them difficult to standardize. Governments could not easily measure, tax, or centrally manage backyard perennial food systems. They didn't fit into ration books or yield forecasts. This tension, became important later when wartime necessity gave way to post-war reconstruction. When the war ended, Europe didn't just rebuild, it reorganized. Food policy shifted toward maximizing output, mechanization, and export efficiency. Annual crops suited this model perfectly. They responded well to chemical fertilizers, machinery, and monoculture. Perennial vegetables did not. Perennials occupied land permanently. They complicated crop rotation schedules designed for tractors and standardized inputs. They resisted uniform harvesting timelines. In an era obsessed with productivity metrics, anything that couldn't be neatly counted or optimized was labeled inefficient, even if it had proven life-saving just years earlier. There was also a psychological element. Perennial survival crops became associated with deprivation, occupation, and hunger. Jerusalem artichokes, despite their nutritional value, were rejected across post-war Europe because they reminded people of scarcity. Food policy is never just about nutrition. It's about memory, identity, and aspiration. Industrial agriculture, in a way, quietly erased centuries of survival knowledge. After the war, agricultural reform, especially under American influence, really emphasized yield, uniformity, and scalability. Seed companies, focused almost entirely on annual hybrids. Meanwhile, universities were teaching farming systems optimized for machinery and chemicals. Perennial vegetables, which could be propagated without buying seed each year, well, they were just economically inconvenient. Over time, these crops disappeared from catalogues, curricula, and, honestly, our collective memory. Some did manage to survive in monastery gardens, rural hedgerows, or fringe communities. Others vanished entirely. And, this was not an accident. It was a deliberate narrowing of what counted as modern food. The irony here is that many of these vegetables actually required fewer inputs, resisted pests naturally, and provided consistent nutrition across seasons, qualities that modern agriculture today struggles to reintroduce under the banner of sustainability. Wartime reliance on perennial crops really reveals something about resilience under pressure. World War II showed us that resilience is not about efficiency in ideal conditions. It is instead about endurance under failure. Perennial vegetables thrived precisely because they assumed disruption as the norm. They didn't depend on annual planning cycles or intact infrastructure. Military doctrine absorbed similar lessons. Redundancy, decentralization, and adaptability became core principles in logistics planning after the war. Yet civilian food systems moved in the opposite direction, concentrating production and narrowing diversity. The disappearance of these crops reflects a broader post-war gamble that large-scale systems would never again fail catastrophically. History has not been kind to that assumption. Why these forgotten crops matter again in the 21st century. Today, supply chain disruptions, climate instability, and geopolitical tension have revived interest in food resilience. Ironically, researchers are now rediscovering the same perennial vegetables wartime civilians depended on 80 years ago. The lesson is not nostalgia, it is humility. World War II did not just test armies, it tested food systems. The plants that survived were not the most productive on paper, but the most forgiving in reality. Forgetting them was a choice shaped by economics and optimism, not evidence. Remembering these vegetables means remembering the quieter battles of the war, the struggle to eat, to endure, and to adapt when systems collapsed. These stories matter because they show how survival often depends less on innovation than on what we choose not to forget. If you value this kind of in-depth, historically grounded analysis, subscribe to The Survival Record. And if this story added something to how you understand war, resilience, and preparedness, share it with someone who takes history seriously.